perhaps some clarification or elucidation on what is meant by a language-based apologetic and outreach as a rationale for what one believes. For example, some people hold to, they identify themselves as confessional. That's great. I've never really, well, as I would say, I haven't been a Christian long enough to go after people because they acknowledge confessions. The New Hampshire Confession and Exposition, this is by O.C.S. Wallace. I've mentioned it before, but the Declaration of Faith in the Baptist Way book by Dr. Benham Bogard is this New Hampshire Confession. Now, this is an exposition, so there's quite a large amount of material. This is dedicated to B.H. Carroll, first president, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and James P. Boyce. So confessional, you can have a lot of data, good, I guess, it's solid, it's sound, valid. I don't know anyone that's ever really taken a lot of issues with the Declaration of Faith Baptist, but as an apologetic and outreach ministry that's language-based, for example, Dr. Penn's Historical Holistic Hermeneutics, it's a handbook for practitioners. This is to direct people toward the text and then lead out from there. And if you start here and go to the text, which is fine, you can see that this is sound. That is, it's not something that should alarm people, and you'll have questions. People will always debate the implications of some of our theological terms. It almost becomes jargon for people who don't really seek it out to learn it. But if you really want to go into the text, which is what we do. So when there's matters of dispute, for example, right now I'm in dialogue and people have really responded, let's say strongly, toward total depravity. Some call it total hereditary depravity. And I was reading someone who had written a book on why he does not support any of the points of Calvinism, any of the 5 points. And I believe his name was Hudson, Hutson. And he wrote a book about it. Well, in it he said he believed in total depravity, but not in total inability. Well, according to many people, unless you believe in total inability, you don't really understand total depravity. So to lead out from the text, however, it really limits the assertions that we can make. We can't say that in one particular text that's what Paul had on his mind, for example, unless it is in a context and that is actually what he was discussing. But to find the total depravity expanded to, or depravity expanded to total depravity, then total hereditary depravity, then somehow that switch into the implication being total hereditary inability, and then that continue to extend by implication to mean total hereditary inability to believe the gospel when preached or when heard or when read. That's a long way to go to get there. Now, if you start in the text, you might not find a passage or a context where that's a topic of discussion. I was once asked why I do not discuss certain things that are often heard and repeated, and I just said, well, unless it's discussed in the Bible, I really don't discuss it in a class where I'm trying to introduce, or literally am introducing, the Bible and what's that particular context and what's the emphasis here. I use numerous texts about the Godhead, but the text I'm using about the Godhead were not necessarily texts that the writer at the time, the author, was using for the Godhead. Maybe it was a reference to the Godhead or a feature of the Godhead that was being mentioned and it was understood by the hearer. So yes, I can take occasions throughout the Bible, context and expressions of the Godhead, and teach those and help someone understand the fullness of the Godhead which dwelled fully in Christ Jesus, bodily that is. So that's very legitimate. It's just sometimes we get so far removed so that when we lead out from the language originally, it seems disappointing to others that we're starting from, let's say, the text. So we're taking our hermeneutics and going back to the text. We're looking up the words in their context according to their etymology. We look at it through a lexical, syntactical analysis, if you will, a lens that through which we analyze the text. And then we lead out from there and expose and teach that and assert it. So we want to gain that. That would be our what we'd call our first, our highest valued interest in the text would be what was the first thing and the one thing the context does convey. Now, to use text, and as people have done, and anyone that's ever studied depravity knows that there's discussions over degrees of depravity, the totality of depravity, the hereditary nature of depravity, the extent of man's depravity. So all that's well and good. It's just we probably don't have as many contexts for those discussions as we would like. So as frustrating as it can become, a language-based apologetics, because most people, actually more than most people, have a strong aversion to biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek. So that's fair. This ministry here is not intended to cause people to appreciate Koine Greek or biblical Hebrew. This is not a language appreciation class. This is an outreach ministry that can help remind people, for you have some constructs that aren't Christian. That is, they aren't even, it's not about the Bible. So would I be uncomfortable in a class where we're discussing depravity, the totality of it, the hereditary nature of it, the implications of it? Absolutely not. And I would enjoy the dialogue. But I wouldn't want to leave out the fact that text from which we might retrieve support for it might not have been the purpose for which that text was written. That's always a reminder. That's something that I suppose I remember initially it was very frustrating, because as soon as I thought I'd found what I was seeking, it was really about something else. It really wasn't the point or aim of it. However, when we're not really acknowledging depravity at all, that would be troubling to people, because what really are we talking about, since the English word depravity is not there? Well, that drives us to search out those words, because apparently the King James translator, for example, William Tyndale, for example, might have supported that word and used it in his own writings. I don't know yet, because I'm about to add to my resources the complete works of William Tyndale. But he didn't include it in his translation. That is, it's not in the King James translation, which 80 to 90% of it is all Tyndale. So I haven't gone back and done a word search on Tyndale's translation. He may very well have it, and I would really like to know what was the original term that he translated into the English word depravity. That would be a great study. But to question depravity as a reality, I don't know. I think that's often difficult for people. If you question a word, it can bother people. The truth is, starting in the text and assuring that you've mastered, if you will, or more rather been mastered by the context, and shown appreciation that the word deserves, and then, as we would say, let's assure that we remember about whom the Bible speaks. The scriptures speak of Jesus. Let's always make sure we don't walk away with sides having been formed and people finding themselves further and further removed from the text. For example, if I speak of a dividing line, I'll say the gospel, for example. Well, if we trusted into Jesus in order that we might be justified out from the faith of Christ, that word faith is faithfulness, it's a concrete word. Well, that faithfulness of Christ includes everything Jesus did. From the fact the scriptures say he is the chosen one, he was the one, a lamb slain, so that when Adam did his specific act of disobedience, Jesus became slain from that time. And that now becomes the emphasis of what took place, not rather what happened to Adam as much as now what did that cost Jesus. We then see him as the Lamb from God. We see him as the last Adam, the second Adam. We see him being faithful, obedient unto death, even the death of Christ. We see his obedience hyper, if we will, hyper abounding, superabounding the offense of Adam. So his obedience hyper abounded. Romans 5:20 is where that is. And we see him fulfilling the law with all his heart, soul, mind, body, and strength, becoming a curse, hanged on a tree. Now that's the dividing line. For example, let's say a Dr. Michael Brown who teaches loss of salvation, forfeiture of salvation, being unfathered, becoming unsaved, becoming unsanctified, becoming unjustified. It's just an entire series of a negation of everything the scriptures say. Well, I don't really care what Dr. Michael Brown's opinion is of a phrase, total depravity. It would mean nothing to me. I'd be interested in people who believe the gospel and what they believe about it, and we could have a conversation, but I couldn't agree with Dr. Brown about total depravity, and I would not care to disagree with him about it. His issue would be between himself and his rejection of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's plenty in the Bible we can know for the dividing line, but I wouldn't use the forensics of soteriological constructs as a dividing line. I use the gospel of Jesus Christ. So when someone rejects the gospel, it doesn't matter if they support any points of Calvinism or no points of Calvinism. And if someone says they believe the gospel, but they add to faith plus something of a future performance on their part, that's not faith and that's not the gospel. So we have so much, but to help people understand an apologetic and outreach ministry that's language-based, we start there. And then, as I said, I have enough grammar, enough syntax, enough etymology, enough lexicography to use the categories, the inspired words in the Bible, to make definitive, clear demarcations from the lie and totally separate the truth from the lie without having to incorporate, let's say, comments, for example, in wonderful confessions. I'm certain these are wonderful. 1689, Second London Baptist, the Declaration of Faith of the Baptist, this New Hampshire 1833, the Philadelphia Confession. So plenty of good things out there. It just does not find that they just do not find themselves essential as absolute truth when it comes to the words that are in the text. So I have plenty of Greek words, plenty of biblical Hebrew, and then of course we have all the English words we can stand as I use the King James Version and then go and look to see which words those were translated from. So you have a good day. I hope that helps you out. Enjoy your studies. Start in the text and go forward. If you're very familiar with confessions, great. You don't have to burn your confessions. If you are unfamiliar with hermeneutics, go to the webpage, Lamp Theological Institute on baptistlamp.org, and this is in PDF format. You couldn't find a better starting point to become a practitioner of hermeneutics, and you'll certainly find so much more that's written, and that is the preferred manner of demarcation. So if we want to separate Christ, we want to separate God, we want to separate the truth, we want to guard the gospel, we can do that with the Bible words quite well. And then when we are assured that a person supports the gospel, we don't need to negotiate over jargon and other things. That's for us as fellow believers, brothers who are all supporters of the same gospel. We can talk and work together, but I really have seen so many people commingle their theological jargon as to almost camouflage their rejection of the gospel. So when someone like Dr. Michael Brown rejects the gospel, I'm not really interested in any of his theological jargon. I'm not interested in what a Benny Hinn would say. I don't care whatever these other people say. They can salt their rejection of the gospel with all the theological jargon they want, and that's just as negative as you can be. And I don't support negativity. I don't need to assault, accuse. It's just when someone rejects Jesus, that's enough. So you have a blessed day.